Ladies and gents, we are talking oppressive builds. These are builds revolving around the Oppressive Darkness artifact. Now today I'm going to give you 3 builds, one for the Warlock class, one for the Titan class, and one for the Hunter class. They will be timestamped, so if you want to just go look at a specific one, go right ahead. The main thing I want to boil down to is which one of these is actually the best when combined with these artifact mods. And believe me boys, the damage involved with these artifact mods is extremely nasty. Matter of fact, some of these builds can actually allow us to kill Greg in just one grenade throw. One grenade throw is able to put Greg down, which is pretty amazing, okay? Like, I know we have many other builds involving like 1-2 punch, liar's handshake, super damage. One grenade is able to do the damage equivalent of some of our supers here in Destiny. So first up, before we get into builds, let's just go over the artifact mods that we're going to be using today. We will be attaching overload grenades, which allow our void grenades to cause disruption, essentially delaying ability energy regeneration and lowering combatant damage output, specifically strong against overload champions. Now we're also going to be pairing this with the artifact mod right underneath it, which is Disruptor Spine, which improves the effects of disruption, lowering combatant damage output even further. Now this is not necessary to combine with the Oppressive Darkness. Oppressive Darkness by itself states that causing damage with void grenades adds a weaken effect to enemies. This could be used separately from overload grenades and Disruptor Spike, but it has some very nice synergy there to pair together with it. But just note, those artifact mods play no effect on Oppressive Darkness in terms of its debuff, as well as the damage that it causes with void grenades. Now again, before we get into the builds, Oppressive Darkness is super beneficial because it is a debuff, meaning things like Weapons of Light, Well of Radiance, those things being buffs can still stack with this debuff. And again, you can stack one buff with one debuff. Now the debuff percentage with something like Oppressive Darkness is 30%, which actually ties with things like Hammer Strike or Shattering Strike as the best debuffs in the game, at least in this sandbox, considering that Hammer Strike used to give us a 50% debuff, now it only does 30%. And again, another thing that makes this thing so beneficial is, of course, the ease of use. You don't have to go out of your way to get a Hammer Strike in, or to set up a melee with something like Shattering Strike, or even close the gap with something like Tractor Cannon. You simply have to just throw your grenade. Now, the only downside to this ability in terms of that debuff is the duration in which it debuffs your enemies. The duration is about 6 seconds, which is what Hammer Strike and Shattering Strike used to be, but both of those have been actually buffed to 10 seconds, considering they got a big nerf in debuff percentage. So that's kind of like the pros and cons of both of those. You have a longer duration with something like Hammer Strike, but the setup is a little more difficult, whereas this just requires a grenade, so the setup is a little easier, but the debuff duration is not as long. Now, I was questioning whether or not the 6 seconds began after the last tick of damage from the grenade, as in, if I was to throw a Vortex grenade at Greg, would the debuff 6 seconds start on the last tick of damage from the grenade? It actually doesn't. It starts from the very beginning, meaning that debuff duration, for the most part, will end as soon as the grenade quits doing damage, which kind of brought some confusion in this, because some people thought that the duration there was only like a 1 second debuff because they were counting from when the grenade quit doing damage. But no, it actually starts from the initial damage from the void grenade. So whether you're using like sticky grenades, axion bolts, or even just vortex grenades that does damage over time, across the board, you're looking at a 6 second window there for that debuff of 30%. Okay, with all of those things out of the way, and I know we just rambled like crazy, let's get in the builds. So first up, we have the Titan class, and yes, boys, we're gonna be rocking Heart of Inmost Light. Now, Heart of Inmost Light has a very unique exotic perk called Overflow Light. It states using an ability, grenade, melee, or barricade, empowers the other 2 abilities. And then it goes on to define that empowered means abilities have a faster regen, melees and grenades do more damage, and barricades have more hit points. Now, I have been playing with Heart of Inmost Light for a very long time, and there is like a flowchart method to actually proccing this thing in the most efficient manner. Ideally, you want to always get 2 stacks of empowering at the bottom left end of your screen. I have tried various combinations. My conclusion, the most reliable way of getting to empowering times 2 is step 1, pop your barricade. Step 2, melee an enemy. And in step 3, you throw your grenade. Now, as far as I know, this is like the only way to really reliably proc empowering times 2, which is important because it substantially increases our damage here. You see, a void wall grenade, which by the way, is one of the best damage dealing grenades in the game, especially in PvE, has a duration of almost 6 seconds. It's like 5 seconds, maybe a little more, and does 2,861 damage per tick. That's the burn burn damage, essentially, or the void wall damage from this grenade. Now, with empowering ×1, me just simply either getting a melee off or popping a barricade increases our damage here by 30% to 3,719 damage. This is a substantial increase. Like, Heart of Inmost Light is already a very good exotic, purely from an ability cooldown perspective, but to also get a 30% buff on it is extremely nice. With empowering ×1 plus Oppressive Darkness, we now see a 69% increase in damage to 4,834 damage. Now, this is really curious because Bungie actually stated in Sandbox 2.6.01 that when things stack, they would no longer stack multiplicatively. That seems to not be the case here with our artifact mods, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that our exotics, or at least in Heart of Inmost Light's case, it was not an additive buff, but instead a multiplicative buff, which is substantially better. Now, with empowering ×2, so this is me popping my barricade, then getting a melee off, and Oppressive Darkness, we actually get a damage buff here of 120% at a whopping 6,284 damage per tick. That is a ginormous bump there overall, which is essentially allowing us to kill Greg in one grenade hit. Now, of course, it probably wouldn't have been able to actually one-hit Greg here had it not been Coda the Commander. This subclass in general is the best subclass to pair with Heart of Inmost Light, especially with these artifact mods. You've got Controlled Demolition, which attaches those void detonators. Each one of those void detonators will explode upon further hits, which does like some AoE damage, but simultaneously it procs the perk Resupply, which grants you grenade and melee energy, which then further decreases our cooldown, stacking on top of empowering with Heart of Inmost Light. And if you happen to be getting those 2 stacks of empowering, say you're doing the barricade to melee, you're most likely going to be proccing Tactical Strike, which causes an immediate void explosion when discharging your melee ability. And again, all of this ties in so well with the Void Wall Grenade, because the longer the target is standing in it, the more detonators you attach, the more explosions you have, and the more you proc all of these perks. And again, those detonators that are exploding causes like this semi-stun that you see here on Greg, which is like keeping him in that Void Wall Grenade even longer. Beautiful, guys. This is beautiful. When I see this, it's heaven. This is the kind of synergy that we always want to see more of. Now, with our other grenades, we don't get the big benefits that we get from Void Wall Grenades in terms of damage. Magnetic grenades aren't necessarily bad. They do some good damage, and I would say they're probably better than suppressor grenades, at least in PvE. But I will say there are times that you cannot take advantage of Void Wall Grenades, as the damage really relies on your target having their feet on the ground. And if you take something like Oryx here, who has no feet and doesn't stand on the ground, obviously something like a Void Wall Grenade is practically useless, which is why I'm having to use sticky grenades here. So Void Wall Grenades, excellent for dealing with anything that's standing on the ground. By far the best grenade when dealing with high health targets. It has damage that can rival that of certain supers, and it applies a 30% debuff. All around, guys, a very well-rounded build here. Now, moving on, we have a Hunter build, which takes advantage of 6 Coyote and double dodge, which essentially just allows us to get a second dodge charge. But we're also taking advantage of Bottom Tree Night Stalker, which is Way of the Pathfinder, which got a substantial buff in Shadowkeep Sandbox, as it comes with perks like Lockdown, which allows for grenade effects to last twice as long, but also Combat Provision, which states that damaging enemies with grenades grants melee ability energy, but also making your allies invisible grants grenade energy. Now, it says making allies invisible. You can just make yourself invisible, right? Throw smoke at the ground. This will immediately grant you some grenade energy back. So both of those tying together in combination with something like Oppressive Darkness was allowing our grenades to do some massive amounts of damage. Now, which one of the grenades is best here? Spike grenades, Void Wall grenades, and Vortex grenades. In terms of PvE, there's a lot more options here on the Night Stalker class, which kind of made it a little more difficult to decide which one of these grenades was the best. Spike grenades actually did some pretty decent damage. The issue though was placement. Like sometimes I would angle the grenade and wasn't angled correctly or something, and it would like miss the target almost outright. But there's kind of a skill curve to this one. So assuming that you spend enough time with this grenade, it'll probably do pretty well for you. And it does a great job of just clearing so many adds out in a very wide effect. Now, in terms of like damage output, Vortex grenades seem to do the least amount of damage, although it still did very good damage. Spike grenades seem to do more damage than Vortex grenades, but it had a little harder time in terms of placement. And of course, the benefit of Vortex grenades is it has that pull-in effect that like sucks the enemy in and keeps them close to the grenade. But Void Wall grenades here, again, the same as it was on the Titan class, seems to be doing more damage than all of the other grenades. Again, not as difficult in terms of placement as say something like Spike grenades, but of course harder to place than something like Vortex grenades. Now, Now, the reason why we're rocking 6 Coyote, which is an odd one, I'll agree with you. It's very strange, and I was not expecting to use this exotic, but I was trying to find a way in which I was constantly taking advantage of the subclass perks as well as constantly throwing grenades. Now, a lot of this was like at tier 3 or tier 4 discipline. That could have been higher, which probably would have benefited this a lot more. But essentially what I would do is I would go in, I would throw a grenade. As the grenade was doing damage to Greg here, I would throw a smoke at Greg. Now, the reason why I throw a smoke at Greg is I'm rocking Enhanced Impact Induction on our gauntlets here, which states that causing damage with a melee attack greatly reduces your grenade cooldown. So simply throwing a smoke out there, which is what you want to do anyways, because it ties up the enemy in your Void Wall grenade. It's essentially a wombo combo all over again, allows for this perk to be procced, thus dropping the cooldown of our grenade substantially. Now, the next step is I dodge, and I take advantage of Gambler's Dodge, which gives me my melee back immediately. Upon doing so, I now throw the next smoke at my feet and cause myself to go invisible, which now grants me even more grenade energy. Now, I know this sounds like a lot to do, but it really wasn't that bad. I mean, hunters, you mostly roll on the ground all the time anyways. You might as well be taking advantage of all these perks while you're doing it. But I found myself still waiting on a grenade, even after all of this work, which brought me to Enhanced Bomber. Luckily, on our class item, Oppressive Darkness costs 6 and Enhanced Bomber costs 4, which means we can actually put those two together if we have a class item fully maxed out. Each time I dodge, though, I'm greatly dropping my grenade cooldown, which is why something like Double Dodge on 6 Coyote is so valuable here. Now, there are other exotics that I tried. I tried Frosties with rapid cooldown. This one wasn't too bad, but you're still going to be sitting there waiting for your grenade to come back. I also tried Graviton Forfeit, as it allowed for our melee ability to recharge faster while we were invisible. The issue with this one was that the perk on our gauntlets, Enhanced Impact Induction, actually has like a small cooldown. I really don't know what the length is, but you cannot just sit there and keep throwing smokes over and over again. So to me, guys, if you're wanting to utilize an impressive build on the Hunter class, where you can just throw grenades back to back, 6 Coyote with Enhanced Bomber, Oppressive Darkness, and Way of the Pathfinder seems to be the best route to go. And just to top everything off, I've actually got an Armor 1.0 helmet with Enhanced Ashes to Assets. So I'm kind of getting the best of both worlds here in terms of like neutral game synergy as well as some super regeneration. Overall, guys, this is not a bad build. And in terms of just damage overall with our grenades, especially with Oppressive Darkness and Void Wall grenades and Lockdown for that double duration, it actually has some extreme potency. Not as lethal as something like Empowering ×2 on the Titan class. The difference, though, is the hunters have to put in work on the tail end, which is sometimes a little easier to do if whatever it is that you're attacking is already being hit for damage. Whereas like the Titan with the barricade melee setup with Empowering ×2 before it ever actually even throws out a grenade, that's a little more setup on the front end. And again, all of the perks in this subclass are such good perks, especially in like 980 Nightfalls when you're trying to keep your team alive. The first couple of weeks of 980 Nightfalls, we were constantly going invisible before pushing up on barrier enemies, and it made life for us so easy. Now, moving on, the Warlock build, which is one that we've went over before. Again, pretty much all of these builds are builds we've already gone over before, like before Shadowkeep even launched. This one is one you may have seen a couple of players already use it. The Esoteric is one that uses this build all the time when he solos things like Nightfalls, and it essentially is Controverse Hole and Vortex Grenades. Now, Controverse Hole comes with the perk Chaotic Exchanger. You resist incoming damage while charging your Void Grenade with Chaos Accelerant, Feed the Void, or Handheld Supernova. Charged Void Grenades return a random amount of grenade energy on hit. Now, that random amount is what it says. It's just random. Sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's a little. But when you combine it with something like Attunement of Chaos with Chaos Accelerant, which greatly increases the duration there of our Vortex Grenades, this essentially always means you're going to get a grenade back. Like throwing a Vortex Grenade out on an enemy, if you can land it on them, already has that pull effect, right? It keeps that enemy locked in place for the most part. And that duration of that Vortex Grenade, especially with Chaos Accelerant, should always mean you will have a grenade back, which means you will always have this 30% debuff on enemies no matter what. This makes it much easier when dealing with things like Barrier Knights and other high health targets that are just super tanky. But even in general, like if you're just trying to like close off an area where a lot of enemies are just running through it, throw a Vortex Grenade down and watch the explosions go. You've got things like Bloom on this subclass tree, which causes enemies to explode on void ability kills. And if you happen to be sitting there waiting for your grenade, Entropic Pool, which is the melee ability, will actually recharge your grenade. This build requires little to no setup and is the easiest oppressive build out of all of them. The only downside to this build is that it actually does less damage than both our Hunter build and our Titan build. But again, that is from a grenade to grenade perspective. effective, a 1-to-1, and requires no setup other than just to charge your grenade. Like, even though the Titan build does more damage overall, it doesn't nearly have the ease of use as Chaotic Exchanger in Attunement of Chaos. So yeah, it takes like an extra 2 grenades here to kill Greg. But look, I never have to wait. I'm constantly just chucking grenades out. I'm also taking advantage of something like Distribution, which actually reduces all of my ability cooldowns when I use my class ability. But granted, you could still rock something like Enhanced Bomber here, but I don't even think you need it. I'm at a tier 5 discipline stat right now, and look how fast I'm getting my grenade back. That is all due to Controverse Hold. It's doing all of the heavy work. You just simply have to make sure whatever it is you're hitting stays inside of that Vortex grenade. Now, in terms of damage overall, Axion Bolt, Scatter Grenades, Vortex Grenades, it's very apparent Vortex Grenades, at least with Oppressive Darkness, is the best route to go. Scatter Grenades does decent damage, but not nearly as good as something like Vortex Grenades, and the problem with something like Scatter Grenades is that the duration there is really short, so the chances of you taking advantage of something like Chaotic Exchanger in terms of that random amount of grenade energy that you get back upon hit is not very likely, which is why Vortex Grenades is the superior grenade for this build. And Axion Bolts is definitely a no-go here, at least with Controverse Hold. It just hits one time, and the damage that the grenade does never really takes advantage of Oppressive Darkness. Like, you're still gonna get the debuff, but since the grenade only hits once, it'll never really take advantage of Oppressive Darkness on itself, which again proves Vortex Grenades to be the superior grenade. Well guys, these are your oppressive builds in the current sandbox. I've had like the same people over and over again asking me to compare grenade damage overall in terms of void grenades go. I'm hoping this answered your question on what builds you should be rocking out for each one of these. Well fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
Slap that like button like your mama told you right.